Mongolia is a vast country. And one of the least populated on Earth. I'm Andrew Laurie. In the last 2 summers, I've been to the Mongolian Altai in search of a fascinating small bird, the white-throated dipper. I've been to many parts of Mongolia over the years, and I'm constantly amazed by the country's natural diversity. From rolling grassy plains to snow-capped mountains, from deserts to vast wetlands and dense forests. This summer, 2019, I'm heading to the Altai again. So join me to find out more about one of the most remarkable wild birds of Mongolia. The Mongolian name for the dipper, Gyatlan омруут харзлай, means roughly gleaming-breasted resident of streams that don't freeze over in winter, despite air temperatures dropping to minus 45 degrees. I once worked on a wildlife conservation project in the Mongolian Altai. And I lived in Hovd city, about 1,100 kilometers west of the capital, Ulaanbaatar. And there, each winter, within about 40 minutes walk of my apartment, dippers congregated along the outflow from a spring. They dispersed again as the weather warmed up. Now dippers have long been an obsession of mine. I wanted to know where they went and where they nested. I looked out for them on summer field trips, and I asked local ornithologists, but I never found out. And then, several years later, in 2016, Gombobatar, an ornithologist from the University of Mongolia, sent me this photo of a dipper with a leaf in its beak. It looked as if dippers were nesting in the Winch Gorge, 200 kilometers south of Hovd and about 2,000 meters above sea level. The following year, in May 2017, I headed for the spectacular Winch Gorge myself. On my first day there, I saw a dipper feeding. And the day after that, found a pair building their nest. I watched and filmed and did some rather unsystematic netting of the rivers to check for dipper food. As in other parts of their range, dippers in Mongolia eat a lot of insect larvae, particularly caddisfly, stonefly, and mayfly, here in a little field guide. They open caddisfly cases by cracking them against stones. I went back to the area last summer too, and watched and waited. Waiting rewarded with displays such as this one near the nest. Some nests were very low down near the water. One nest was in the roof of a cave. The males fed their females on the nest while they were incubating the eggs, something very rarely recorded. We found dippers mainly on the smaller rivers. They bred on the Hujirt, the Nutskan, and the Arshan, tributaries of the Winch, and on the Hjacht, further to the east. Last year, 2018, some rivers, such as the Hujirt, dried up or became clogged with algae. Food was scarce, and almost no nests were built. One pair built a nest, but deserted after laying just 2 eggs. The Nutskan, however, was healthy with a good food supply, and the dippers there laid full clutches and incubated. A herder we talked with pointed out that the Hujirt, with its smaller catchment, is much more vulnerable to dry conditions than the Nutskan, with its much more extensive catchment. I wondered, however, what else might be affecting the dippers, and whether populations were increasing or decreasing. Both years, I drove the 1,500 kilometers from Ulaanbaatar to the southern Altai. Stopping at night, it took 3 days by car. Mongolian expeditions arranged transport and camping equipment. Local people were very welcoming, and they were happy to talk about dippers.
Таарваа штэ. Тэгээ өмнө нь одоо хичнээн жилийн өмнө бас нэг иймэрхүү болж исэн.
2008 онд нэг ийм болдгоо яада. Ийм тал байсан байх.
Although some at first thought I was another big game hunter, come to shoot ibex or argali. Herder Maksajov was puzzled. He asked me why on earth I had come all the way to the Altai just to watch dippers. I told him that I'd been hooked on dippers since my school days in Shropshire, when I kept nest records at Downton and wrote them up for the school natural history journal. There are 5 species of dippers. They live only on unpolluted rivers, and watching dippers later tied in with my work as a conservation advisor in several places around the world. I still check on the Downton dippers. It's been sad to see numbers declining. Dipper distribution and population sizes have been decreasing across the UK. Greater agricultural pollution, flooding, and sediment load are likely causes. Dippers were once far more numerous, and they were widely persecuted. Bounties were paid for dead dippers and their destroyed nests. People thought, wrongly, that dippers reduced fish catches. The Duchess of Sutherland paid 6p a dipper for 548 of them on her estate between 1831 and 1834. There are strong conservation reasons for studying dippers. They're totally dependent on clean, fast-flowing streams and rivers that support insect populations sensitive to pollution. So a thriving dipper population indicates a good flow of unpolluted water and can help to track the effectiveness of conservation measures. Peter Morby has been studying the fluctuating fortunes of the dippers of the Loon Valley for 60 years. He was my school biology teacher when he introduced me to watching dippers and finding their nests. I told him about the Mongolian dippers, and we discussed why the males feed their females so much during incubation, and what might be affecting breeding success in the Altai. The Altai Mountains are known for their unique habitats, with 300 species of plants found nowhere else in the world. They're also home to the rare and vulnerable snow leopard. Generations of Mongolians have lived in the wide open spaces of the Altai. The traditional herding lifestyle treads lightly on the land. And now, as economic development pushes on, it's important to limit the growing human impact on the environment. That's not always easy. Higher numbers of livestock are degrading rangeland and contributing to water pollution. The market for cashmere has encouraged people to keep more goats. And goats, with their broad diets and their sharp little hooves, are particularly destructive. Hunting of wildlife continues. The environmental impacts of mining are growing. Of artisanal mining too. Glaciers are receding as the climate crisis builds, and the survival of the traditional herding lifestyle is at risk. Happily, more and more Mongolians are becoming advocates of the importance of biodiversity, both for its intrinsic value and as the basis of human life. The government has been active in conservation, often in partnership with NGOs and development organizations. Hundreds of animal traps were confiscated by rangers in 2016 as part of a broad approach to tackling damage to wildlife and the ecosystem. National parks and other state protected areas now make up 21% of the area of the country, an even higher percentage in the west of the country. The dipper sites I've been visiting are in or beside the Mungharken Winch Gorge National Park and the Myankan Orgelzat National Park. Protected areas, although vital, are not sufficient on their own. Their boundaries do not always follow watershed boundaries, and activities upstream can pose threats. For example, the Hujirt and the Nutskan flow into the Mungharken Winch Gorge National Park, and there are threats from mining upstream. We met artisanal miners in 2018, and mining licenses have been issued on the Nutskan. A camp visitor told us that a Chinese mining company is proposing to divert water from the upper reaches of the Nutskan. So sound environmental policies and action outside protected areas are also vital. The 2010 Altai Mountains Biodiversity Conservation Strategy put protected areas in the context of human livelihoods and the wider landscape. Current far-reaching policies on land management are built on this, and local citizen groups have called for better mitigation of the impacts of mining in particular. To assess the impacts of such strategies, snow leopard movements have been tracked with camera traps and by satellite. Monitoring dipper populations is perhaps not as exciting, but it can be a valuable way of measuring the impacts of conservation programs in the mountains. After watching nest building in May 2017, I went a little later in the season in 2018 to cover incubation. The aim of this year's trip is to cover feeding of the chicks in the nest. Dippers incubate for about 17 days, so it looks as if the best time to arrive will be late June. I hope that I do indeed get to the Altai as the chicks are hatching. After a few days in Ulaanbaatar, we headed for the Altai.
And here I am, in my tent on the Hyacht River.
The first 2 days of the long drive west went smoothly, but on day 3, just past the huge Hoshot coal mine, with little more than 100 kilometers to run, the cooling system failed on our Mitsubishi Delica, and we had to spend a noisy night in a truck park. The next morning, driver Khurulbat worked on the car with local mechanic Burne. Some of Burne's other customers lent a hand too, and assistant Batwire set up a little kitchen beside the car while we waited out a long power cut. After an anxious few hours, the repair was done, and we drove on. The road was busy with 60-ton coal trucks bound for Xinjiang in China. But just 1 kilometer up the Hyacht River, we pitched camp in another world. The roar of traffic was replaced by the sounds of the river and the call of the common rosefinch. Last year, the riverbed was covered with algae and the dippers failed to breed. So it was great to find no algae and plenty of dipper food available, caddisfly larvae in particular.
We saw a dipper soon after arriving, and tomorrow morning we'll start looking for its nest. Dipper nests are well hidden, and it often takes a day or two to find one. If I see 2 dippers together, or 1 dipper more than once at the same spot, I find a high vantage point and watch the river, trying not to be distracted by other wildlife. Well, patient watching paid off. We found a nest, difficult to see here beside a fallen clod of turf, on the evening of day 5.
The female is incubating, taking 5-minute breaks away from her eggs about every 50 minutes. Dippers in Mongolia occur in a fascinating range of plumage patterns or morphs. The female here is pale morph, and the male is darker, so in this pair, it's easy to tell the birds apart. The male is feeding the female both on and off the nest with very loud churring noises. At peak times, he feeds her on the nest once every 10 minutes. And when she comes off the nest, he feeds her nearby. Mate feeding during incubation is very rarely seen in Europe. Perhaps there is something about the food supply, or the timing of it, or the temperature of the water in these Алтаи streams that favors such behavior. It's reported in the American dipper in some parts of its range.
It was great watching the Hyacht male feeding his mate, but I filmed that last year, and the whole aim of this year's expedition is to watch feeding of the chicks in the nest. So as the eggs hadn't hatched, we left the Hyacht on day 9 and headed on here to the Nutskan.
Camping by the Nutskan, we've had to put up with more biting flies than last year. But it's a fine place to spend a week, with Siberian ibex in sight in the early mornings on the valley ridges. Khurulbat and Batwire are both keen observers, and we exchange news about what we have seen each day. Most herders have moved to higher pastures, thus avoiding the flies, but we have had a few visitors, Last year's nest site beside camp has been washed away. But after some detective work in the early morning of day 10, I found another nest. It's in a remarkable place, 40 centimeters into a tunnel under the bank and only 10 centimeters above water level. The parents' activity told us that the eggs had hatched. Here too, as on the hyacht, the sexes are different morphs. The female is pale morph and the male a darker morph. Last year there was a dark female and a light male in this territory. So this is a different pair. The male was bringing food in, and the female was still brooding, keeping the chicks warm. She was taking breaks to feed herself, but had not begun to feed the chicks. Within a couple of days, both parents were feeding the chicks, often in intense bouts of up to 15 times within 45 minutes. Even after a week, the female still broods the chicks for up to 30 minutes at a time, either feeding them first or coming in with no food. The female always scurries along the tunnel very fast, almost like a rat, and she often swims up to the tunnel entrance, popping out of the water on arrival. She almost always dives into the water on departure. And sometimes she creeps in and out via the mossy overhang far under the bank. That is very difficult to spot, even when watching closely. The male always flies in, takes a good look around, and then walks down the tunnel. He often goes in and out several times, delivering the food little by little, and then washing his beak. He usually flies off, but occasionally he dives into the water, just like the female. The parents are bringing in a lot of aquatic insect larvae. They often catch them very near the nest. Sometimes they bring in winged insects too, caught on the bank. Or even in the air. Both parents take out the chicks' droppings, roughly once every 6 feeding visits. The female sometimes comes out with droppings and then goes back in again to continue brooding. It's important for many species that droppings do not accumulate and draw the attention of predators. Sometimes leaves and other bits of nesting material are taken out, with or without droppings. When male and female meet at the nest, they either pass each other without incident or have a brief interaction. When the dippers are away, the local grey wagtails keep me entertained. They have a nest nearby and are also feeding young, almost entirely with winged insects. Every couple of days, we have been checking on what is happening upstream. Last year's cave nest site has not been used, but there is a new nest nearby. A pair of dippers has been coming and going, but the nest is empty, not even lined. Perhaps this is a second attempt at breeding after an earlier failure. But the pair's behavior is not coordinated. I think the paler bird is the female. She has been taking material up to the nest. But she also spends a lot of time collecting nesting material that she then flies off with in other directions. We couldn't find any other nest, and she later dropped this beakful at the top of the nearby waterfall. The male visits the nest too, but rarely and without nesting material.
There's so much to watch here on the Nutskan that I don't want to leave. But tomorrow we'll head north to check on the Hujirt, where breeding failed last year. I really expected dippers to be nesting here on the Hujirt this year, particularly as the hyact has recovered so well. But apart from one unconfirmed sighting, we haven't seen any dippers so far. No sign either, and dipper droppings are very distinctive. The stream, although a bit low in places, is clear of algae, but there are very few insect larvae. It looks as if there'll be no breeding here for a second year running. The smaller catchment might explain the lower water level, but why so few insect larvae? Could there be pollution from artisanal mining?
I started thinking about that and other possible explanations, some linked to global climate change.
Now we're back on the hyact, and we've camped nearer the nest this time. As soon as we arrived a couple of days ago, I hurried over to the nest to check on progress. And yes, the female, the paler bird, is now taking food to the nest, so the eggs have definitely hatched.
She's been busier than the male. Although she's still brooding the chicks for up to 10 minutes at a time, several times a day, she's been feeding them about 11 times an hour. That's almost twice as often as the male. It's quite difficult for them to get a firm grip on the earth below the nest. The parents often queue up to feed the chicks. As on the Nutskan, the pair sometimes pass each other without incident. And on other occasions, the female seems to attack the male, particularly when he comes to the nest with food. I don't know why. Perhaps just being close to the male makes her want to beg for food. Both birds pick up the chicks' droppings, usually just after feeding, but sometimes before feeding, still holding the food. They go for the slightest traces of white. And if they see a new dropping fall, they are quick to fly up and remove it. I never get tired of watching these birds. Quite apart from the benefits of studying them as sentinels of change, dippers can be a source of great wonder and fascination for anyone who takes the time to look and listen. It was mixed fortunes for the dippers this year, with recovery on the hyact, another good year on the Nutskan, but failure on the Hujirt for a second year running. It would be good to build on these anecdotal observations and start monitoring dippers systematically as part of a wider conservation program.
We've packed the tents, we've packed the car, and we have a 3-day drive now, taking it in steady stages back to Ulaanbaatar. I don't know whether I'll be back again next year, but if I do come, I would try to come later again in order to be able to see young dippers on the river having left their nest.